To understand why the most powerful naval force in the history of the Pacific was destroyed in the span of 5 fatal minutes, we must look away from the American pilots who became heroes. We must look instead at the men they defeated. We must look at the psychological disease that was rotting the Imperial Japanese Navy from the inside out. The competitor might tell you that the Battle of Midway was a miracle or a stroke of luck. But that is a comforting lie. The truth is far more disturbing. The destruction of the Japanese carrier fleet was not an accident. It was an engineering inevitable, a disaster that was programmed into their system months before the first shot was fired. It begins not on the burning deck of an aircraft carrier, but in the quiet, smoke-filled wardroom of the largest battleship ever built. It is late May 1942. The location is the Hashirajima anchorage in Hiroshima Bay. At the center of this protected harbor sits the battleship Yamato. It is a floating fortress, the flagship of the combined fleet and the symbol of Japan's naval supremacy. Surrounding it are hundreds of warships stretching as far as the eye can see. This is the Kido Butai, the mobile strike force that has never known defeat. For 6 months, since the attack on Pearl Harbor, they have swept across the Pacific Ocean, crushing the British, the Dutch, and the Americans with terrifying efficiency. They have ravaged the Indian Ocean and humiliated the Royal Navy. They are not just confident, they are intoxicated. In the high command of the Japanese Navy, the officers had a name for this psychological condition. They called it senshobio, the victory disease. It is a collective delusion where a series of easy wins convinces a military force that they are invincible. It creates a reality where the enemy is viewed not just as weak, but as incompetent. And it was here, in the luxurious officers' quarters of the Yamato, weeks before the battle, that the seeds of their own destruction were sown. The officers had gathered for the final war games. These were complex tabletop simulations designed to test Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's grand strategy for the invasion of Midway. The plan was a masterpiece of unnecessary complexity. As the intelligence reports later noted, it involved scattering Japanese forces across thousands of miles of ocean. There were diversionary strikes in the Aleutian Islands to the north, an invasion force coming from the southwest, and the carrier strike force approaching from the northwest. The goal was to lure the American fleet out of Pearl Harbor and destroy it in a decisive battle. During the simulation, however, the plan fell apart. The officer playing the role of the American commander, the Red Team, launched a surprise flank attack against the Japanese carriers. He rolled the dice. He did the math. The result was catastrophic for Japan. The referees ruled that 2 of the Empire's precious aircraft carriers were sunk, and a third was heavily damaged. The room went silent. This result was mathematically possible. It was tactically sound. It was a warning. But instead of changing the plan to address this fatal weakness, the presiding officer, Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki, stepped in. He refused to accept the result. In a moment that defines the entire tragedy of Midway, he reached down to the map, picked up the marker representing a sunken Japanese carrier, and placed it back on the board. He overruled the umpire. He declared that the Americans could not possibly pull off such a maneuver. He arbitrarily reduced the damage from sunk to slightly damaged, and then eventually erased the damage entirely. In the fantasy world of the Japanese staff, the carriers were resurrected. The plan was perfect because they decided it had to be perfect. They erased the possibility of defeat, believing that their spirit alone could bend the laws of probability. This arrogance blinded them to the physical facts of the war. While the Japanese were playing games with rigged rules, the Americans were fighting a war of information. The Japanese staff assumed that the American fleet was demoralized and sitting in Pearl Harbor, waiting to be destroyed. They did not know that American code breakers had been reading their messages for weeks. But the Japanese failure was not just about codes. It was a failure of their own reconnaissance. The victory at Midway was forged not just in the cockpits of dive bombers, but in a damp, windowless basement in Hawaii known as Station Hypo. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team of cryptographers worked in red flannel robes to stay warm against the constant air conditioning required to cool their early calculating machines. They lived on coffee and cigarette smoke, sifting through thousands of groups of numbers in the Japanese naval code. While the Japanese believed their communications were impenetrable, Rochefort was piecing together the entire grand strategy of Admiral Yamamoto. However, a critical problem remained. Rochefort knew when and how the Japanese would strike, but he could not prove the exact location of the target designated only as AAF. The high command in Washington was skeptical, fearing that the Japanese might be planning a strike against the Aleutian Islands or even the west coast of the United States. To solve this, Rochefort devised a brilliant and simple trap. He ordered the garrison on Midway Island to send an unencrypted radio message stating that their seawater desalination plant had broken down. 2 days later, American intercept stations caught exactly what they were looking for: a Japanese flash message reporting that AF was low on fresh water. The mask was removed. Rochefort's ruse proved that the target was indeed Midway, allowing Admiral Nimitz to ignore the diversions and commit his entire carrier force to a single point of ambush. The Japanese had planned their own vital mission called Operation K. The concept was simple and daring. 2 massive Kawanishi flying boats were supposed to fly from the Marshall Islands, land at a remote reef called the French Frigate Shoals to refuel from a submarine, and then fly over Pearl Harbor to confirm the location of the American aircraft carriers. It was the only way to know for sure if the trap would work. But when the Japanese submarine arrived at the refueling point at French Frigate Shoals, they found a nasty surprise. The Americans were already there. 2 United States Navy ships were anchored in the lagoon. The Japanese submarine could not surface. The planes could not land. The mission was scrubbed. A prudent commander, realizing that his eyes had been blinded, might have paused. Without this reconnaissance, Admiral Nagumo, the commander of the carrier strike force, was flying blind. He had absolutely no confirmation of where the American ships were, but the victory disease had taken complete hold of the operation. The staff on the Yamato simply assumed the best-case scenario. They assumed the Americans were still sleeping in Pearl Harbor because it was convenient for their plan. They did not try to find another way to check. They sent the fleet into the unknown based on a guess. While the Japanese admirals were indulging in self-deception, the American industrial machine was performing a miracle of engineering. Following the Battle of the Coral Sea, the aircraft carrier Yorktown was a wreck. Japanese pilots had reported her destroyed, and Nagumo's staff was absolutely certain she was at the bottom of the ocean. The ship had limped into Pearl Harbor with a shattered flight deck, flooded compartments, and destroyed internal communications. Engineering experts at the shipyard estimated that a full repair would take at least 90 days. But Admiral Nimitz did not have 3 months. He had less than 72 hours. More than 1,000 shipyard workers boarded the Yorktown the moment she entered the dry dock. They worked in 3 shifts around the clock. While water was still being pumped out of one end of a compartment, welding teams were already at work in the other. The internal temperature of the hull reached over 50 degrees Celsius, and the air was thick with smoke and the smell of ozone. But the work never stopped. Men pushed themselves to the point of collapse to patch the steel giant. When the 72 hours were up, the Yorktown sailed out to join the fleet. Her internal bulkheads were still supported by temporary wooden timbers, and civilian repair crews were still on board finishing their work as she went into battle. For the Japanese, the appearance of the Yorktown at Midway was a shock that destroyed their tactical mathematics. They expected to fight 2 carriers, but they faced 3. This was not a stroke of luck. It was a victory of logistics and human will over Japanese academic planning. On May 27th, the fleet set sail. It was the largest assembly of naval power the Pacific had ever seen. The heart of the formation was the 4 heavy carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These were massive ships, veterans of Pearl Harbor, capable of launching over 60 aircraft each. Behind them trailed battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. They sailed into the rain and mist of the North Pacific, maintaining strict radio silence to avoid detection. But this radio silence became a trap of its own. By forbidding radio traffic, the scattered parts of the Japanese fleet could not talk to each other. Admiral Yamamoto, trailing 300 miles behind in the battleship Yamato, had information that Nagumo did not have. But he could not break silence to warn him. The strike force was isolated in its own vastness. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the Akagi. He was a torpedo specialist, a man of the old-school Navy, now in charge of the most complex aerial weapon in the world. He looked out at his flight decks, packed with the best pilots on Earth. These men were the elite. They had thousands of hours of flight time. They were the samurai of the sky. Nagumo steamed confidently toward his target, secure in the belief that the Americans would react exactly as the Japanese plan dictated. He believed they would be surprised. He believed they would be slow. He did not know that the Americans were already waiting. He did not know that the resurrected carriers from the Wargame were sailing directly toward a fleet that knew their entire operation plan. He did not know that the timeline he was following was a work of fiction created by his own superiors. As the massive bow of the Akagi cut through the dark waves of the Pacific, the countdown had already begun. The Japanese Imperial Navy was not sailing to victory. It was steaming at 25 knots toward the coordinates of its own extinction. It is 7:15 in the morning on June 4th, 1942. On the flight deck of the Akagi, the atmosphere is one of disciplined routine. The first wave of Japanese aircraft has already completed its strike on Midway Island and is heading back to the fleet. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stands on the bridge, waiting for the results. To the officers around him, the operation is proceeding exactly as the Wargames predicted. But the clock is about to become their greatest enemy. At 7:28, a message arrives that shatters the calm. A scout plane from the cruiser Tone, which had launched late due to a mechanical failure, reports sighting what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships. For Admiral Nagumo, this is a moment of paralyzing realization. The intelligence he had relied upon was wrong. The American fleet is not in Pearl Harbor. It is here. Nagumo now faces a tactical dilemma that will decide the fate of the Pacific War. He has a second wave of aircraft sitting in the hangars below. These planes were originally armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs specifically to attack enemy warships. However, 45 minutes earlier, Nagumo had been convinced that no American ships were in the area. He had ordered his reserve planes to be stripped of their torpedoes and rearmed with high-explosive land bombs for a second strike on the Midway runway. The rearming process is halfway complete when the report of the American fleet arrives. Nagumo must make a choice. He can launch his aircraft immediately with the land bombs they currently carry, or he can order another reversal to put the torpedoes back on. Japanese naval doctrine, which prioritizes perfection and massed strikes over speed, dictates the latter. Nagumo orders his men to switch the weapons for a second time. This order triggers a catastrophe of logistics inside the hangars. A Japanese aircraft carrier hangar is not an open space. It is a fully enclosed steel box designed to protect aircraft from the elements. Inside this stifling environment, hundreds of mechanics and armorers begin a frantic, manual race against time. The weapons they are moving are not small. A Type 91 aerial torpedo weighs over 800 kilograms. The land bombs are massive steel cylinders filled with volatile explosives. Under normal operating procedures, every bomb removed from an aircraft must be immediately returned to the safety of the armored magazines deep below the waterline. But the elevators are already working at maximum capacity. The officers are screaming for speed. The mechanics, exhausted and sweating in the enclosed heat, begin to ignore safety protocols to save seconds. Instead of lowering the land bombs to the magazines, they simply stack them against the steel walls of the hangar. They pile high explosive ordnance directly on the hangar floor next to fueled aircraft and pressurized aviation fuel lines. In their haste to prepare a perfect strike, they have ignored the basic physics of fire and explosion. They have effectively packed the interior of their ships with enough unsecured explosives to destroy them from the inside out. The danger inside the Japanese hangars was magnified by a fundamental difference in naval philosophy regarding damage control. On an American carrier, every single sailor was trained as a firefighter. From the highest officer to the lowest cook, every man knew how to operate a fire hose, how to seal a watertight door, and how to isolate a ruptured fuel line. The American doctrine assumed that the ship would be hit and focused entirely on survival. The Japanese Navy, however, relied on small, highly specialized damage control teams. These were elite professionals, but they were few in number. In the rigid hierarchy of the Imperial Navy, a common sailor was expected to stay at his post and follow orders, not to take initiative during a fire. When the American bombs detonated inside the enclosed hangars of the Akagi and Kaga, these specialized teams were among the first to be killed. With the experts vaporized and the regular sailors untrained in firefighting, the ships were left defenseless against the spreading inferno. The Japanese focus on offensive power had left them without the institutional resilience needed to survive a single tactical error. For the next hour, the hangar decks of the Akagi and the Kaga are the most dangerous places on Earth. They are filled with fueled planes, frantic men, and dozens of live, unsecured bombs sitting in a crowded steel trap. Admiral Nagumo believes he is preparing a crushing blow that will end the war. He does not realize that his rigid adherence to doctrine has turned his elite carriers into floating time bombs. The spark that will ignite this disaster is already approaching, and the Japanese leadership has left their own house in total disarray. At 9:20 in the morning, the horizon is broken by the first American aircraft. These are the TBD Devastators of Torpedo Squadron 8. To the elite Japanese pilots circling high above in their Mitsubishi Zeros, these American planes look pathetic. They are slow, they are obsolete, and they are flying dangerously low, just feet above the ocean's surface. To the eyes of the Japanese veterans, they look like easy prey, and they are. This is the moment where the Japanese defensive system fails, not because it is weak, but because it is too aggressive. Unlike the American fleet, which will eventually learn to use radar to guide its fighters from a central command room, the Japanese Combat Air Patrol relies entirely on human eyesight and individual initiative. There is no central officer telling one squadron to stay high while another engages the low-level threats. When the American torpedo bombers are spotted skimming the waves, the Japanese fighter pilots succumb to a fatal pack mentality. It is a feeding frenzy. Dozens of Zeros peel out of their high-altitude protective formations and dive toward the sea. They are seduced by the prospect of an easy kill and are desperate to protect their carriers from the perceived threat of the torpedoes. The slaughter is absolute. The Japanese Zeros, faster and more maneuverable, tear into the American formation. One by one, the Devastators catch fire and cartwheel into the ocean. Out of the 30 men in Torpedo Squadron 8, 29 are killed in a matter of minutes. Only one man, Ensign George Gay, survives to watch the battle from the water. The Japanese anti-aircraft gunners on the decks cheer as they watch the black smoke rise from the surface. They believe they are witnessing a total victory. They have wiped out the American attackers without a single torpedo hitting a Japanese ship. But in their celebration, they have committed a fatal tactical error. Because almost every single Japanese fighter has dived down to the deck to join the fight, the sky above the fleet is now completely empty. The high-altitude patrol sector is abandoned. There is no one left to watch the clouds, and no one left to intercept an attack from above. The Americans have unknowingly executed a perfect tactical distraction. By sacrificing their torpedo crews in a suicidal low-level run, they have pulled the entire Japanese defensive shield down to sea level. The lid over the Kido Butai has been removed. The Mitsubishi Zero was a legendary weapon, but its incredible maneuverability was bought at a terrifying price. In the pursuit of weight reduction and extreme range, Japanese engineers had completely eliminated armor protection for the pilot and, most critically, self-sealing fuel tanks. In the Japanese artisan philosophy, the pilot's skill was supposed to be the armor. But in the sky over Midway, this design choice became a death sentence. A single burst of machine gun fire from an American fighter was enough to turn a Zero into a falling torch. The fuel would ignite instantly, leaving the pilot no chance of survival. Furthermore, at the high speeds required to intercept diving bombers, the Zero's flight controls became heavy and unresponsive. As the American dive bombers began their descent, the few Zeros that remained at high altitude found themselves unable to effectively maneuver against the gravity-driven speed of the Dauntless. The very engineering that made the Zero a master of dogfighting made it useless as a high-altitude interceptor. On the bridge of the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo and his officers are relieved. The attacks have been repelled, and the evasive maneuvers have worked. The carriers are now turning back into the wind to launch their own counterstrike. The flight decks are crowded with fueled planes, and the hangars are still packed with unsecured bombs. It is 10:22. The Japanese fleet feels invincible again. The gunners lower their barrels, their eyes fixed on the burning wreckage in the water. Nobody looks up, and directly overhead, at 19,000 feet, unseen and unopposed, the tip of the spear is already rolling into its dive. At 10:22 in the morning, the atmosphere of triumph on the bridge of the Akagi is shattered by a single, terrifying scream from a lookout. High above the fleet, 3 squadrons of American SBD Dauntless dive bombers have appeared out of the sun. They are already beginning their vertical dives at speeds exceeding 250 miles per hour. For the Japanese sailors on the deck, the world suddenly moves in slow motion. To understand the carnage that follows, we must look at the specific engineering of the Japanese carriers. Unlike American ships, which were designed with open-sided hangars, the Akagi and Kaga are built with fully enclosed steel hangar decks. This design is intended to protect aircraft from the weather, but in this moment, it turns the ships into massive, reinforced pressure cookers. The first hits occur on the Kaga. 4 1,000-pound bombs smash through the wooden flight deck and penetrate deep into the upper and lower hangars. Because the hangars are enclosed steel boxes, the blast waves from the American bombs cannot escape. The shock waves bounce off the steel walls, amplifying the destructive force. No bomba это только детонаторы. The true fuel for the catastrophe is the fatal switch that Admiral Nagumo ordered earlier. Inside the hangars, the floor is littered with the land bombs that were hastily stripped from the planes. Because the mechanics were rushed, these high explosive weapons were not returned to the armored magazines. They were simply stacked against the bulkheads. Когда американские бомбы детонируют, они запускают массивную цепную реакцию. The loose Japanese bombs begin to cook off, exploding one by one. This is not a fire. It is a thermal explosion. Thousands of gallons of high-octane aviation fuel from ruptured hoses spray across the decks, turning the hangars into an inescapable furnace. The elite technicians and mechanics, the men who represent the institutional memory of the Japanese Navy, are vaporized instantly. They are trapped inside a steel tomb where the temperature rises so fast that the metal structure of the ship begins to warp and buckle. On the flagship Akagi, a single 1,000-pound bomb dropped by Lieutenant Richard Best strikes the center of the flight deck. It penetrates the upper hangar and explodes directly among the fueled and armed torpedo bombers waiting to launch. The resulting secondary explosion is so violent that it blows the forward elevator, a massive platform weighing many tons, completely out of its well. The elevator spins through the air like a piece of debris before crashing into the ocean hundreds of yards away. By 10:30 in the morning, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers were burning ruins. But one ship remained. The Hiryu, positioned several miles to the north under the cover of a rain squall, had escaped the initial attack. Her commander, Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, was a leader of a different caliber than Nagumo. If Nagumo was a cautious pedant, Yamaguchi was the embodiment of aggression. Standing on the bridge and watching the pillars of black smoke rise from the Akagi and Kaga, Yamaguchi did not hesitate. He immediately ordered his remaining planes into the air. His pilots launched, knowing they had no home to return to. In a desperate act of retaliation, they twice attacked the Yorktown. They saw her burn, they saw her stop, and both times they reported her sunk. They could not believe that American damage control teams were extinguishing the fires and restarting the engines even as the battle continued. Because of this resilience, the Japanese made a fatal error. They believed they were attacking two different carriers, when in fact they had hit the Yorktown twice. By evening, the Hiryu shared the fate of her sisters. Struck by 4 bombs from the Enterprise, Yamaguchi refused to leave his ship, choosing to go down with the last carrier of the Kido Butai. With his death, the Japanese Navy lost its most aggressive tactical mind, a leader who might have understood how to fight outside the rigid confines of their failed doctrine. The sun begins to set over the Pacific on June 4, 1942, casting long, bloody shadows over a sea filled with oil and wreckage. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, the silence that follows the roar of the American dive bombers is more terrifying than the explosions. In less than 1 day, the heart of the Kido Butai, the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, and later the Hiryu, have been reduced to burning hulks. But the true magnitude of this defeat is not measured in sunken tonnage. The true disaster is the total annihilation of Japan's institutional memory. The competitor might focus on the physical loss of the ships, but the real story of Japan's collapse lies in the people they lost. Over 3,000 sailors and airmen were killed. This included over 100 veteran pilots who had years of combat experience, men who understood carrier operations in ways that could not be taught in a classroom. These were the artisans of the sky. Japan's pilot training program was a slow, meticulous process that produced only about 100 carrier pilots per year. In 5 minutes, an entire generation of that elite expertise was incinerated. This is where we see the clash between two different worlds, the artisan and the hammer. Japan built its navy like a fine sword, perfect, sharp, but incredibly brittle. The United States, however, was an industrial hammer. Even as the Yorktown was being abandoned after taking multiple hits, American shipyards were already operating on a scale the world had never seen. While Japan struggled to complete even 6 new carriers, the United States was already building 24 new Essex-class carriers. The American system was designed to absorb losses, learn from mistakes, and produce warriors and machines at a rate that made Japanese perfection irrelevant. The aftermath of the battle also revealed the deep rot of the victory disease within the Japanese government. When the survivors finally returned to Japan, they were treated as a shameful secret. Wounded sailors were moved from ships to isolated hospital wards in the dead of night. They were forbidden from speaking to their families. The Japanese public was told that Midway was a massive victory, a lie that prevented the Navy from ever fixing the critical flaws that led to the disaster. Потому что они отказывались признать поражение, они не могли научиться побеждать. Admiral Nagumo, the man who stood on the bridge of the Akagi and watched his world end, survived the battle but never recovered from the weight of his decisions. He would eventually commit suicide in 1944 as American forces overran Saipan, a final tragic consequence of a rigid doctrine that chose death over adaptation. Even Admiral Yamamoto, who had warned that Japan could not win a long war, was eventually hunted down and killed by American planes that were once again using decoded messages to find him. Midway was not won by luck. It was won by intelligence officers who broke the codes, damage control teams that saved ships everyone said were lost, and pilots who pressed their attacks against impossible odds. It proved that in modern warfare, the ability to adapt is more powerful than the pride of an undefeated empire. The 4 carriers of the Imperial Navy still rest on the bottom of the Pacific, 3 miles down, serving as steel tombs for thousands of men. They are a permanent reminder that the victory disease is the most terminal illness a nation can face. The war would continue for 3 more years, but the outcome was decided in those 5 minutes on a clear June morning when the American pilots tipped the scales toward freedom.